So, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. What can I say? I had to follow Brian Honen's talk, and I'm between you and lunch. So it's not the easiest sessions to do, but I hope to try and keep you entertained throughout. So my name is Joseph Carson. I'm based in Estonia, so I've traveled all the way from Estonia to be here. But you're probably guessing, where's that accent from? I'm originally from Belfast, so it's a good time to get here and to be talking to you. So I've been privileged. First of all, can we give Brian a big round of applause, because organizing these conferences is so difficult. And also doing ad hoc talks when you have to fill spaces is also a challenge as well. But I've been privileged. I'm here to talk about a session. I'm going to take you through a real-world story about a ransomware victim. So one thing I always think is, we always talk about the attackers, and we talk about what they did, and we talk about the different incidents. But I like to take it sometimes from the approach of the victim and try to understand about how their experience was, what they were doing, what they were thinking, the challenges that they faced. And this is going to take you through that journey. And this was not a sophisticated cyber attack. It's basically textbook ransomware incidents. So I want to tell you their story. I've been fortunate enough to be able to be approved to tell their story. Most victims don't want to be known. Most victims don't want to tell you that they've been a victim. So they've been privileged, and their point of me sharing the story is they want to prevent you from making the same mistakes that they did. They want to help others prevent from having that same incident and same damage to the business. So I'm going to take you through the journey. So this incident starts with the variant of Krylock. So Krylock was a ransomware basically that evolved out of the previous version, which was Cryackle. And actually, Kaspersky did a fantastic research on blog on Cryackle that they did have significant weaknesses in the encryption method that was used. But Krylock, which was the second generation of that, evolved around early 2020. And it was one of the earlier ransom groups that actually started to use the affiliate program, ransomware as a service. So rather than actually delivering the ransomware themselves, they actually would give it to other criminal organizations who would actually gain the access and deploy it. So they basically are specialized in the creation of the crypto itself, and then give it to others who will actually use and abuse it. So this is basically, it was an interesting version, a variant that was being used. And this is basically an organization who one day, Sunday morning, saw this on all their servers and machines that was connected to their network. Now, for many organizations, what you'll typically hear or learn about a ransomware incident is either from your employees. You might find about from your customers, your partners, your contractors. In this case, the actually ransomware group emailed the IT department and said, you've become a victim of ransomware. And they started giving instructions, they started giving communications. So this was basically the first lessons that they learned when they became a victim. Now, of course, this triggers your typical incident response. And one of the things, what I want to make sure that we all understand is there's a big difference between incident response and being incident ready. There's a big difference. Having an incident response plan that you went through, you created your checklist, you created your plan, you put it in a drawer, and then 2 years later, you become a victim and you take that out and you try to figure out how to follow it. There's a big difference between incident response plan and actually having incident response readiness. And this is a massive difference. In this particular incident, this was a major lesson that this organization was not incident response ready. They actually hadn't agreed on time format, naming conventions of gathering images. They didn't have any policies in place about how HR should communicate. They didn't have actually legal counsel about how they should actually, from a legal perspective, did they have to follow things like GDPR? Did they have to notify the Data Protection Authority? They actually hadn't communications or established connections with law enforcement about how they should deal with it. The national cert. They didn't have actually communications and relationships established. Also, evidence gathering. They didn't know how to collect evidence and maintain it and prevent damaging or tampering of that evidence as well. They also didn't have identities or access that was segregated. We actually, in the incident response, we had to use the same identities that the criminals had already compromised in the environment in order to gain control. Contaminates evidence. That's the last thing you want to be doing. They also had lots of service accounts that they didn't know how to rotate credentials because of the fear of breaking more systems. One thing that I always have is a go bag as well. because you never know how long. When you're actually dealing with an incident, you could be sitting in a data center for a long time without actually having any access to food. So having something ready to go, huge amounts of clean, sanitized disks as well, because you will go through lots of hard disks and taking lots of images. Also, alternative means of communication. Many times, you might not have access to email. Your phone system might be a VoIP phone system, which might not be available. So also making sure that your readiness goes through making sure you've got set up alternative means of communication as well. Many organizations have a support team or help desk. Also having the help desk practice and be prepared, because when that goes public, once the criminal gang puts something out on social media, on Twitter, they will get an influx of calls from worried customers, worried partners. It will actually have a massive impact in the organization's support and help desk. Having the plan and having practice drills is so critical. So make sure you differentiate between the difference between being incident ready and having an incident response plan, and make sure you keep it updated and keep it practiced. This organization, they had a plan, but they were not prepared when the incident happened. So they did have a checklist response, which was a bit outdated. This is one that I helped them create and helped them actually improve as we went through the incident, making sure they had clear definition of who's responsible and ownership for what part of the incident. And one of the things they realized was there's a big difference between a security incident or an IT incident and a business response, a business incident. Because they had traditionally looked at their incident response plan as being something that it was only an IT team response. They didn't realize that actually an entire organization, the business had to come together to respond. So making sure you've got clear ownerships of who's communicating what. Having an updated contact list, including access to specialists and experts who actually do this on a daily basis. Also, clear definition of the threat. Understand what you're dealing with. Make sure that you know what type of incident. Is it data exfiltration? Is it ransomware? Does it self-propagate around the network? Does it laterally move? Do the attackers still have access? Are they DDoSing the environment as well, holding up the service? Having a clear definition will also help make sure you have relevant press statements prepared for those different types of responses as well. Understanding your in-house capabilities. This was an IT team who also did security, but they were not security experts. So they didn't have outsourced or external retainers with experts who could come in quickly to help them. They didn't understand about how to contain the incident itself. They had no press statements ready. They had actually legal counsel, but they didn't have any legal assessment for risks, things like GDPR. They didn't understand about how to eradicate. What recovery practices were also done, and also going through that lessons learned. So it's important to also make sure you have this checklist and actually do it and practice it on a regular basis. So when I come in to help them, I responded, and some of the questions that I go through to make sure I understand how actually severe the incident is. Some of the questions I will have are things like, did they have access to the domain controller? Did they have access to domain accounts? What about systems? So in this case, yes, the attackers did have full domain administrator access. And I will actually take you through the process of how they did that and the attack path that they took. They had access to the systems which were online. So it happened, of course, early hours of Sunday morning. So fortunately enough, a lot of the employees had taken their laptops home and were not connected to the network. So they were actually prevented from becoming victims. The machines at the office, a lot of the machines had actually been switched off by the employees. So also they were excluded from becoming affected. But any machine that was connected that was online in that infrastructure became infected. The attackers had access to all the corporate applications. They had access to only the on-premise environment. It hadn't laterally moved to the cloud. So they were fortunate enough that their cloud environment had been segregated and actually prevented because it allowed some element of the business to continue. The investigation found that the attackers had hands-on keyboard access for approximately almost 2 weeks. So just a little bit over 14 days, almost 15 days, was the active time that they were actually hands-on keyboard in the environment, doing enumeration, searching for privilege elevation, and looking for basically their crown jewels, their very valuable data, to make sure that they actually cause as much damage as possible. The entire attack, actually, the first instance of the attack was 7 months prior. 7 months prior to that, and I'll get to that shortly. So that's kind of the length of time. 2 weeks of active keyboard, 7 months of the initial attack had started. I'll also go through, I like to understand about what tools and techniques they use. So I'm going to share with you some of those tools as well. Also, what types of backdoors. You find a lot of the criminal gangs will also leave backdoors. So even if they do get payment or don't get payment, they might decide to sell that access to other criminals who will actually use and abuse it as well. There's a massive market for actually selling access to organizations. And actually, this particular case, there was multiple parties involved. There was a criminal gang who specialized in gaining access. They sold the access to another criminal gang. That criminal gang bought the access. They bought the cryptors and then used that access to gain an initial foothold in the organization. And then the help desk, the team that was communicating with the organization, was also a separate. They were a help desk for hire in order to help communicate because, of course, the criminals don't speak native English. So sometimes you're dealing with multiple attackers in that attack chain. Also understand about what data did they take and how did they take it as well. What was the entire timeline? Creating that super timeline using things like Plasso or log to timeline in order to understand about the series of events. And actually, when we did the log to timeline, it actually uncovered more interesting other incidents that had happened in the environment that were not related to the ransomware case itself. Things like somebody had deployed a crypto mining software in the environment and using the organization's computer resources to mine cryptocurrency. So sometimes you'll uncover other incidents and other events when you do these super timelines. And also what evidence is remaining, another important area. So we get through, when you go through that questions, one of the things you start thinking about, well, how do we can get that organization back to recovery? How we can get them back to business? How can we make the organization move forward? I tend to have 3 responses. Sometimes there's 4, but mostly 3. Let's restore from your backup. Well, I've got unfortunate news. The backup's also encrypted. They had a backup system, but the backup strategy was not actually tailored or actually focused around ransomware prevention. It was actually focused around data corruption. It was focused around hardware failure. So we have to make sure that if you have a backup and recovery strategy, that you make sure that actually is effective against ransomware, not just against hardware failure or data corruption. Because the last thing you want to be doing is looking at your backup server and it's also encrypted, so you're left with nothing. So this is the story. Their backup server basically was also fully encrypted. So it left them to the next choices, paying the ransom. They started negotiating with the ransom. And actually, an interesting survey that we did at Psychotic Centrify was actually recently the survey, and actually relates to some of the comments that Brian had made, was actually more than 80% of organizations are paying the ransom to recover. 80% of organizations funding the next generation of ransomware crime. It just means it's going to get more improved and evolved ransomware. It's going to make our jobs more difficult in the future. So it's really important to understand about, is paying ransomware an option? So they decided they're not going to pay their ransomware. They moved to the third option here, which is what rebuild. How do we rebuild? Fortunately enough, they actually did a server migration 1 year prior to that. 1 year prior, their ERP system went and did a migration. The system that they migrated from was actually due to be deprovisioned and repurposed. Fortunately enough, it was sitting gathering dust and hadn't been used, so we were able to use that system as a baseline. It meant that they had actually lost an entire year's worth of business data. 1 full year of data was lost. So it meant that we had to go through, in order to recover and look at getting the business back to operations, was to find data in things like paper receipts, inventory receipts, in people's emails, in USB drives. We went searching for as much data as possible in order to start the rebuild process. It took them 3 months to take that 1-year-old migrated database and all of the data that they're actually in other places to try and rebuild. 3 months and a ton of people creating and entering that data in order to get back to somewhat similar operations that they had prior to this. So 3 months of impacted business. Significant. There sometimes is a fourth option, but it's not one that I put here, is that you might find security researchers who are able to find weaknesses in the encryption. They might be able to recover the key, and the key might be found and made public. It might be a static key that's reused across the encryptors. So you might be fortunate enough to find security researchers who do that, but it's not an option that happens often, and it's not enough to put it up here to give you that fourth option. So you're now faced with these options. You're looking at your recovery scenario, you've got your incident response plan, you've got different people tasked with different scenarios. The question is, do the attackers still have access? And in this case, yes, the attackers still had ongoing access. And this is all happening at the same time. All of these decisions are all happening in the first few hours of the incident. The first few hours of the communication that actually was detected. And they're faced with these scenarios. Can we go back to manual operations? Can we go back to paper for a lot of the business? What systems are still operational? What was turned off at the time of the attack? And was the attacker still having persistent active access? And they were. They still had a remote session open up to the environment. So we had to make the tough decision about switching off the internet. So we go back to Ralph, who breaks the internet. We actually had to turn off the internet for this entire business in order to regain control, to make sure the attackers didn't have persistent access. Not a lot of businesses can do that. If you're also dependent on cloud environments, how do you turn off the cloud? Maybe they've severed your access to your environment, so you have to understand about how you can recover that. Fortunate enough, we were able to simply unplug the ISP provider and sever that connection, but it left a bit of a mess for us to clean up. So the next thing that I do is I'm looking for a copy of the cryptor. I want to find out what is it we're dealing with. How severe is the impact? Does this cryptor self-propagate around the environment? Does it also steal credentials? What's the encryption like? So finding a copy of the cryptor is so critical to understand about what it exactly is you're dealing with. And ultimately, basically, I use tools like Joe's Sandbox. You might be familiar with it. Taking a copy of that cryptor and uploading it, and we'll actually go through and run the cryptor in a sandbox to find out, is there a command and control? Does it steal credentials? How does it propagate? What changes does it make in the registry? Is there persistence? So this gives me a really good idea of how severe the impact and what we can do to look at the recovery path. What's our recovery options about how do we eradicate? Do we actually need to rebuild the entire Active Directory and endpoints from scratch? So this gives me a good understanding about how do we recover? What is it we're dealing with? The next phase is, of course, why did your security controls that you had in place not work? This organization had security. It's not that they basically were completely opened. They actually had security in place. They had antivirus, they had ERP systems, they had firewalls, they had multi-factor authentication. Like most organizations, they had security in place. So we want to understand why it didn't affect. What was the impact? Why was it not effective? This is actually a running of it shortly after the incident where most AVs started picking it up. But when we did this initially, the first time we uploaded the variant of the cryptor that attacked them, only 2 out of all the AVs were detecting it. So it meant that if your organization was still running any AVs on this list, that only 2 were actually detecting it out of that. So it meant that we had to look at, well, why wasn't it detected? It was actually a pretty recent creation of the variant. It was pretty new, so not many organizations have become previous victims. It was actually from the creation of the cryptor to deployment was a space of about 3 to 4 weeks. And also we did find that they actually also had other cryptors in their tool set as well. They just decided to use this one because this organization would not detect it. They had other versions. They had double pulsar and a few other variants of ransomware that was ready to go, ready to be deployed, but they decided to choose the Krylock version. So that's one of the things you have to be aware of, that they'll actually be looking at how your systems will not detect it, making sure they're able to be as effective as possible. So they'll actually, first of all, do the enumeration environment and then decide which cryptor to decide to deploy. The next thing, so I like to basically, now I've got an idea of the cryptor. I've got an idea of why it wasn't actually defended, why the organization didn't prevent it. So then I start going through following the attacker's footprints. I start putting my ethical hacker hat on and try to understand about, well, if I was in those shoes, how would I actually do this attack? And start doing the reverse. So the first thing is you're going to go through and you want to find those initial staging systems. You want to find out where basically they gained the access. You want to shut the door permanently. You want to understand about how did they gain that initial foothold? What other systems in the environment did they use for staging machines? Because what they will tend to do is they'll do enumeration. One of the things that Brian mentioned earlier about naming convention, which is always hilarious, sometimes we name the systems so poorly that we actually tell the attackers what the server's doing. This is our ERP server. This is our backup server. This is our SQL server. This is our, access server. We name things to simplify it for us, but we also give the attackers an advantage of making it easier for them to actually understand what task or purpose that machine or server is doing. So it's really important to find these initial staging. But the unfortunate thing for an incident responder is that you tend to find that they're really good at hiding their tracks. For me, going into this environment and starting to try and understand about what was happening is, think about it. You get a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, right? But you only have 200 pieces remaining. And you had to put those 200 pieces together and understand about what the entire picture was, what that full jigsaw puzzle was. That's what it's like being an incident responder when attackers basically are using ransomware to actually hide their tracks. They use their ransomware as ways to actually corrupt the staging machines, to actually corrupt the log files, to clear the evidence. They use ransomware to do that. It's a very effective weapon for them to hide their tracks. But fortunately enough, they didn't hide them well enough. So we were able to basically dissect and find the attack path that they used. So one of the first things we were able to use for basically looking at the logs and evidence that was remaining. And sometimes you'll even look through, for example, when the event logs were cleared, you'll be able to find a timestamp of those series of clearing of the event logs and try to find out which one was the first one to be done and try and navigate and try to create that attack path visibility so you actually understand about how they moved around the network. But one of the first things we find, of course, we're all familiar with PSEC. It's something I've been using pretty much my entire career from basically the Windows internal tools. It's a fantastic tool. It helps us do our job. It helps us do automation. It's great for system administration. But also, not only is it going to be used for good purposes, but it also be used for malicious purposes. In this case, they'd use PSExec in order to actually run scripts and commands around the network. This is how they were using as their automation, the way to laterally move. So ultimately, after analyzing and looking at all the machines where PSExec had been executed and run, we were able to find it back to a few staging machines where those would be initiating from. When we got to the staging machines, we found out that they're actually using SoftPerfect network scanner in order to actually do and run the automation. So that was scanning the network. It was actually being able to pull back the inventory about what servers were doing, what operating systems are running. So we actually use this, which of course can be used, it's used legitimate software that we use for scanning the network, but can also be used for malicious actors. And actually, just to give you an example here, this is actually real screenshots of the actually the scripts and what they'd actually done. I've actually modified it to make it anonymous so that it doesn't reveal any details about the victim. But also, just to note that all of these commands that was actually in the application part of the software was actually in Russian language. I actually had my kids translate it for me. Fortunately enough, I've got kids who speak and read Russian, so they helped me go through and actually translate a lot of the scripts. So it's great if you have kids who speak Russian. They actually help me with my job quite often. My language skills are not my greatest part of my area, but I went through and translated these from Russian to English, which meant that we knew that we were dealing with Russian-speaking or Russian origin of the attackers. The IP addresses that we were able to find basically from the domain DNS and other areas did show that attackers actually used servers in UK, they used servers in Holland, and also Ukraine. So that was some of the countries where we saw affiliations and sources of basically being used, of course, as proxies, known basically malicious IP ranges. So basically what they'd done was automation. This translates back to a lot of the scripts that they'd used, and then also they'd actually created their own local administrators on those staging machines in case they needed to create backdoors and be able to return if the user ever changed their credentials. So this was an indication that they'd use these on the staging machines in order to be the way also to deploy the ransomware itself. The next area, of course, we found on those staging machines was that used Mimikatz. That actually used Mimikatz in order to go from local administrator rights up to domain. If you have users who are local administrator rights, it's literally 2 steps to go from local to domain. I hate we put local in front of it because it makes us assume that it's limited to only the local machine, but it gives the attackers a way to elevate. In this case, they were using, unfortunately, Windows Server 2012, and it was basically one of the SP2 versions, which meant that the registry key here basically had been changed, so default credentials or credentials would not be stored in clear text and memory. But simply by changing this registry key back on later versions of servers will allow you to actually re-enable that. So running Mimikatz will allow you to extract any types of credentials in clear text. Now, one of the things that they'd done, of course, was they went into the machine, they changed their credentials, caused some problems in that machine, leave, clear up their tracks at the same time, and wait for an administrator to log in to fix the problem. And the administrator is going to log in with what? Domain credentials. Help desk worker is going to log in with what? Domain credentials to fix problems, because it gives them the ability to do things ad hoc when they need to. And that's one of the ways they were able to extract the domain administrator. So this is how they got to the domain admin. The next thing that we actually looked for was persistence and backdoors. We want to make sure that we understand about how did they maintain their access. And this has been around for a long time. We've been using sticky key methods since around Windows XP, the early days, that actually used sticky keys in order to create backdoors and persistence on those staging machines. So if you're familiar with sticky keys, what it allows you to do is simply through a registry change, anything in the logon screen, when you're on the logon screen, you've got utility helper, you've got sticky keys, which you basically hit the shift button 5 times and it produces sticky keys. If you hit the shift button 5 times on these staging machines, it will actually pop up a command prompt that was running under empty authority system. And therefore, the attackers could then enable, create users, open up RDP, and create persistent access. So it's really important. They were not looking for these. You need to be actively looking for those registry changes. You need to be threat hunting. You need to be going and searching, do any of my machines have these registry key settings? Do they actually have the Mimikatz registry key setting that allows them to actually extract and clear text? Looking for these proactively. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why they were able to run all of these was the compromised user credential that the attackers had gained access was a local administrator. So the initial user that they gained access, being a local administrator, meant that they were actually able to turn off security. Their sessions were approximately 10 to 20 minutes long, no longer. They would disable security, do their enumeration, make the changes, and then re-enable security and leave. So in the actually endpoint detection and AV, it just looked at this machine dropped offline for a couple of minutes. Actually, the machine looks normal. Security's turned on, it's enabled, it's doing its job. You want to be looking for those periods of times it drops. You want to be looking for those 10 to 20 minute sessions, because those are the times that the attackers are doing their malicious activity. So never give users local administrator rights. It literally gives the attackers a way to hide their tracks and elevate privileges to domain very easily. Of course, this all started with what? A public-facing RDP server. Yes, the company did have terminal services, multi-factor authentication, but during the pandemic, a third-party accountant needed to have access to the accounting system. So they decided that let's do it quickly. So they enabled a particular machine in order to give the accountant access to the environment, outside the visibility of the IT team. It was done within the department. One machine, it only takes one machine, that failure to secure it will give the attackers that access. And of course, going back prior to the 7 months before the attack happened, it was all done through brute force. By bringing that system up, putting it public-facing, will give the attackers enough time in order to gain access. So again, those who specialize in getting the access, selling it to the affiliates, and then buying cryptors in order to actually deploy it, bringing this organization to complete stop. So what things can we do to reduce the risks? And I'm going to repeat a lot of what my peers had said throughout the day, is that it's really getting back to basics. And one thing that Eugene mentioned earlier, he talked about security by design. I think we need to go a bit further. We need to go to security by default. Security should be by default, not just by design, but on and used, and basically we're using it effectively. So it's really important we get to that stage. But having good education in cyber hygiene, your employees should never be afraid to ask for advice. That's one of the best ways. If your employees do something or accidentally click on something and they suspect that they shouldn't have done it, they should not be afraid. They shouldn't be feeling that I shouldn't tell anyone, otherwise I might be victimized. We should empower employees to talk and basically reach out and be proactive, to communicate. Having a backup and test plan and recovery, but actually one that's basically focused around ransomware as well, not just having online servers, having segregation. Getting into zero trust or principal least privilege. Your administrator should not be freely just logging into systems as domain administrators. And those credentials should be rotated after every single use. If they'd rotated those credentials, the attacker would not have been able to leverage those credentials or those hashes to laterally move and reuse it in PSExec. Privileged access security, so they can actually have something they check out and log in the system securely and rotate the credentials for them. Application control that can detect, for example, when PSExec is actually executing out of time? Sunday night, is it normal? And make sure you patch it and update. So at that point in time, we're here, it's all about reducing risk. It's all about forcing the attackers to create more risk, to make their job more difficult. The more risks that they take, the more noise they will create in your networks, giving you visibility to actually detect them and stop them. Ultimately, we're here, the more you know about the techniques that they use and other victims' lessons learned, the more we can do to make it more difficult for them. But ultimately, we have to translate that into business goals and business value to get the budget we need to do the things in order to actually help and be safer. So that wraps it up. I'm here before lunch. I don't know if I've got time for questions. No time for questions. So if you want to talk to me, I'm here for the rest of the day. I'll be outside. We do have a booth at the back. I hope this was valuable. Hope it was educational. Stay safe. Enjoy the lunch and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.